Good afternoon. Welcome again to this daily current affairs lecture series, decoding emerging current issues. Today is 5th December. We will discuss today's important topics related to the climate issue. Okay, to join our Telegram channel, you can subscribe to the Aakar. You can subscribe to the Aakar's YouTube channel, and please like and share our channel and videos so that we can get feedback and inputs from you. Okay, let's today discuss the very first issue that has emerged recently is regarding the climate change and conference of the parties, 26th conference of the party of the UNFCCC in the United Kingdom at Glasgow. Okay, so the countries have adopted this Glasgow Climate Pact at this 26th conference of party of this UNFCCC, and just before this climate meeting, just days ahead of this conference of the parties meeting, the Emission Gap Report, okay, which was released by one of the specialized body of the United Nations, this Emission Gap Report 2021 was released. Okay, and it had some it had highlighted some issues before the meeting so that the leaders can get the insight of what is the current reality and status. Okay, as per the report, these current atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations are higher than at any time in the last 2 million years. So it is saying that though pandemic resulted into the lockdowns and lower CO2 emissions, but yet CO2 emissions are peaking now, and today the current situation is that carbon dioxide concentrations are higher than at any time in the last 2 million years. Okay, as a group, G20 members are not on the track to achieve either their original or new to 2030 pledges. So whatever the pledges they made, they are not on the track. That means the efforts put by these G20 members are not sufficient, and this has been highlighted in many other reports also, where they are saying regarding the acceleration of the efforts by the countries so that we can achieve our climate change goals. Okay, it is saying that long-term net zero emissions pledged by 50 countries, the long-term net zero emissions pledged by 50 countries covering more than half of the global emissions, show large ambiguities. That means there is a lot of confusions regarding the transparency, how the countries will achieve the goals, what specific actions will be taken by them. Regarding all these details, there are a lot of uncertainties and confusions. Okay, the report also has mentioned regarding lack of transparency in the climate actions of the countries, the lack of clearly defined rules, and the target for actual reduction in emissions. So lacking all these things have made our climate actions not sufficient to address the required goals. Okay, now let's try to understand about this 26th conference of party which was held at Glasgow in the United Kingdom. Okay, the main task of this conference of party was to finalize the rules and procedures for implementation of the Paris Agreement, which was done in 2015. Okay, so the main aim was to implement this through the rules and procedures, and for that this meeting was held. Now this was made in 2015, and many of the rules were have been finalized by 2018 itself, but there are some issues which still needs to be resolved. Few provisions like the one relating to the creation of new carbon markets, okay, transparency, and regarding other aspects of a climate change are still to be resolved. So this conference of 26th conference of party meeting was for this unresolved issues. Okay, so as I have told you, this COP26 has dealt with many issues like finance, reporting of the climate actions, transparency in climate actions, rules for creating global markets for trading in the carbon offsets or carbon credits, etc. Okay, the main aim was to push for an agreement that could put the world on a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway instead of 2 degrees Celsius trajectory, which is the main objective of Paris Agreement. Recently, in the past year, World Bank also released one report which said that if we limit our global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, then there will be less impact. And if we confine it to 2 degrees Celsius, then there can be more serious impacts of the climate change on the countries. So this 1.5 degree Celsius pathway is being selected. Okay. Now let's try to understand the outcomes that were that came out because of this conference of the party. First is the new global and country targets. This Glasgow summit has urged the countries to consider strengthening their 2030 targets or pledges by next conference of the party, that is 27th conference of the party meeting, which will be held in Egypt in 2022. Okay, so it is saying that there should be strengthening of the targets. The summit targeted global warming not to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius and go about 1 foot, and it got about 140 countries to announce target dates for bringing emission down to net zero. Okay, so 140 countries have been have announced the target dates for net zero emission goals. India has also joined the consensus and has also announced the target of net zero target of 2070. Okay, the next outcome is phasing down coal consumption. The coal was the main factor of the debate in this meeting. The reduction of the fossil fuels was mainly, the reduction of the emissions through the fossil fuel was mainly concentrated on the coal. We know that coal is the most dirtiest of the fossil fuels, and an early phase out of the coal is clearly desirable. Yes, it is true. And developed countries like European countries have pushed hard for their phase out, means they are want to eliminate the use of this coal. However, developing countries have some limitations. They have opposed this move. Okay, so outcome is that India played a leading role, and a middle path as suggested by India was referred to at the conference of the party meeting, and it adapted phase down approach rather than the phase out approach for the coal based power. So for developing countries, it was a win-win situation, because they need to phase down first, they need to reduce it first, and then gradually they will be phasing it out. Okay, and there is more focus on loss and damage, more focus on adaptation. That is how the communities, how the countries will take actions to adapt to the climate change. Okay, now Indian commitment. What were India's commitment in the summit? Okay, while delivering his national statement on India's behalf, our Prime Minister presented 5 commitments from India towards the climate action at this 26th conference of the party. These commitments are taking India's non-fossil fuel energy capacity to 500 gigawatt by 2030, fulfilling 50% of the India's energy requirement through the renewable energy by 2030, bringing down the carbon intensity of India's economy by more than 45% by 2030, cut down its net projected carbon emission by 1 billion tons from now until 2030, and achieve the target of net zero carbon emission by 2070. So these are the enhanced targets which was announced by this which was announced by the Prime Minister in this conference of the latest conference of the parties of the UNFCCC. Okay. Now, what was the leading role? How the leadership of the India was seen, was perceived, and what is the role of this India in this matter? Many countries have considered India's role as an obstructionist. That means India have played a role which has obstructed a more desired goals. Due to India we could not adopt the desired goals is the criticism of the some of the countries and experts. But if we see from the developed as well as developing countries perspective, it was a win-win situation, and India played more constructive role rather than destructive or obstructionist role. Okay. The main argument, the main role of the India was focused on phasing down coal rather than phasing out coal. Okay. So hours after the final agreement was adopted, the sharp differences between the developed and developing countries came, which was in reference to this phasing out coal and fossil fuel subsidies. So two issues came: phasing out of the coal and phasing out of the fossil fuel subsidies. Okay, now to this outcome of phasing out of the coal means elimination of the coal, completely removing the coal. Okay, India, China, and several other developing countries resisted this outcome, including Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and they objected to this provision that called upon the countries to accelerate efforts towards phasing out of this coal power and inefficient fuel subsidies. So, developing countries, they said we will not be able to do this because we are developing, we need a coal, we need a fossil fuel for our development, for fueling our energy needs, for fueling our economic growth, and we don't have other resources like renewable energy, nuclear power. We don't have that much technology as like a developed countries. So for now, instead of phasing out, let's move to the some middle path, because we will need the fossil fuel more than the developed countries because of our present developing stage. So this was the first time that the phase out of the coal had explicitly been mentioned in any decisions of the climate change meetings. So the developed countries particularly focus particularly on this phasing out of the coal, because naturally now developed countries have moved away from the coal more towards the natural gas and other renewable energy. They have the technologies. Okay, so this was the first meeting when the phasing out of the coal came, and it was seen as one of the progressive element of the agreement by particularly by the civil society groups. Naturally, it was a good outcome. Coal has to be removed, there is no doubt about it, but there are some limitations to the developing countries for that. Our environmental minister Bhupendra Yadav argued that developing countries must not be denied the opportunities for development. Okay, what were the India's arguments for that? India said the United Nations Framework Convention on the Climate Change, that is the UNFCCC, refers to the mitigation of the greenhouse gas emissions from all the sources. So not particularly coal. We can reduce the mitigation from many sources. UNFCCC is not directed at any particular source like coal. Okay, targeting any particular sector is uncalled for. It is not desired. Every country will arrive at net zero emissions as per its own national circumstances, its own strengths and weaknesses. So whatever the conditions of the country is, whatever its developmental stage is, whatever the resources of the countries, whatever its limitation and strengths are there, based on that it will choose a source, it will select a source based on which it will have a target for a reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions. So it is not necessary that coal should be targeted only. There can be many other sources from which greenhouse gases can be reduced. So developing countries have the right to fair share of the global carbon budget. That means use of the coal as a fossil fuel for its energy need. So India said that developing countries need to given a fair share of this use of the fossil fuels, particularly coal, and are entitled to the responsible use of the fossil fuel within its scope. Now, developed countries have used the coal to fuel their economic growth since many decades, since many centuries. But now, when the question of the development of the developing countries is coming, developed countries are denying the right of the developing countries to use the fossil fuels like coal for fueling their growth. So this is a cause of concern because developing countries are mainly dependent on these fossil fuels. They don't have much other resources like natural gas, like nuclear power, hydroelectric power, or other renewable energy sources. In such situation, how can one expect the developing countries can make a promises about phasing out fossil fuel subsidies when it is needed, when they need it? How can they cut the subsidies? How can they phase it out? Okay, developing countries still to deal with their developmental agendas and poverty reduction, for which you need resources, and fossil fuels, particularly coal, is must for that. Okay, he also said towards this end, subsidies provide much needed social security and support. For example, the subsidies provided, okay, for the use of this LPG, that is liquefied petroleum gas, cooking gas, which has improved the health of the women and reducing indoor air pollution. So we put forward, that is India put forward the examples where the subsidies on the fossil fuels, which developed countries now are arguing for the phasing out. India said these subsidies in India are helpful from the development and health perspectives. So we cannot phase it out immediately like developed countries. So backed by China and many developing countries, India has moved a proposal to amend the outcome and replacing the phase out with a phase down in the context of a coal, and to include recognition of the different national circumstances of the some countries, that is developed country and developing countries. So there is a difference, and developing countries need resources, fossil fuels, particularly coal. So there should be phase down rather than phase out. Okay, now this move, as I have already explained you, is justified. Okay, because there is no doubt coal emits twice the amount of a carbon dioxide compared to the fuel gas. Okay, so in case of natural gas and carbon dioxide comparison, the amount of a carbon dioxide, the energy, the greenhouse gases emitted by this carbon dioxide is twice as that in comparison to the use of this fuel gas for producing the same amount of energy. Okay, so if we are producing the same amount of energy, okay, then coal emits twice the amount of a carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide emission from the coal is twice that of the fuel gas. But if you produce twice the amount of energy from the fuel gas as from coal, you will still produce the same amount of carbon emission. That means if you produce the twice amount of the energy from the fuel gas as from the coal, that means if you are using the gas to the extent that is in developing countries you are using coal, in developed countries you are using natural gas, fuel gas, you are using this fuel gas to the same extent and you are emitting more energy than the developing countries. So even though developing countries are using coal, the use of this natural gas or the fuel gas in the developed countries is such that the energy emitted by that fuel gas is more than the developing countries. So US or the EU plus, that is EU plus UK, is producing more carbon emissions than India or Africa. So why ask phasing out only coal, while no such targets are taken by US or EU plus for phasing out their carbon emissions using gas? So if we are using gas and producing more carbon dioxide, then why there should be particular focus on coal? Why not gas? Okay, so this highlights the biased outcome in favor of the developed countries. So this is where the energy justice becomes the very important. The US per capita energy use is 9 times that of the India and UK 6 times. And if we consider the countries in the sub-Sahara Africa such as Uganda and Central African Republic, their energy consumption is even lower. US consumes 90 times and UK 60 times more than these countries. So you can understand, even they are using coal, the carbon dioxide or the greenhouse gas emission from this coal by the developing countries, the emission by the developing countries using coal is much smaller than the emission released by these developed countries using gas. So they are not focusing on gas because they don't have care for coal now. So they are focusing on coal. They want phasing out of the coal. उनको तो कुछ फर्क पड़ेगा नहीं क्योंकि अभी तो वो गैस पे डिपेंडेंट हो रहे हैं ज्यादा. So when they are using more gas, when they are having more dependency on the renewable energy and gas, fuel gas like natural gas, why should they care for coal? So now they have turned their attention to the coal, and which is a matter of concern for developing countries. Okay, now if developing countries are concerned to this extent regarding the climate change, let us try to understand how developed countries actually committed enough to deal with the climate crisis. If they are too much concerned regarding coal, if they want the coal to be phased out, okay, if they are so much concerned with the climate change and carbon dioxide emission from the coal and other sources, in reality, have they taken the enough actions? Okay, the answer strictly is no. Developed countries themselves do not believe they are doing enough. So within their countries, there is an argument that developed countries are not doing enough. They are sleeping badly in terms of mobilizing finance. Okay, so as far as finance is concerned, their contribution, their transfer to the developing countries is very less. As for the to UNFCC's biennial assessment of the finance 2018, the actual flow of the funds from the developed to developing countries amounts to only $30 billion, and that too after the relaxed criteria adopted by the UNFCC. So you can understand, you can see from here that developed countries are very reluctant. They are neglecting the transfer of the finance or mobilizing the finance. Secondly, their interest and therefore focus has been on the mitigation, that is how to reduce the greenhouse gas emission, okay, which are measures for preventing further global warming. So they are not concentrating on adaptation, which is must for the developing countries, which is a needed for a developing countries. Rather, now they are concentrating on mitigation, that is they are concentrating on measures which are required to reduce the emissions of the greenhouse gas emission or of the greenhouse gas. Okay, so instead of adaptation, they are now concentrating more on mitigation, and adaptation is a matter of concern for developing countries, because adaptation is needed for developing countries. It requires technology, it requires finance, okay, it requires innovative approaches, and they are not focusing on this. They are not focusing on loss and damage which are to be paid by developed countries to the developing countries for the losses and damages because of the climate change. Okay, nor are they forthcoming in terms of providing technology. As I have already told you, they are more reluctant. The companies, the multinational companies in the developed countries are more reluctant to share the technology. They want to establish, they want to maintain their dominance. For example, would an American or European company easily give technology for electrolyzers for hydrogen production? Answer is strictly no. India believes in the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. So it says that developed countries are responsible, are more responsible for the climate change issue. So they should contribute more, and developing countries which are developing now are not responsible to the same extent like a developed countries. So there should be differentiated responsibility. So developed countries must take larger share of the actions for addressing climate change. Okay, so developed countries must take the first steps to reduce their emissions drastically more than developing countries. And additionally, they should also compensate the poorer countries by paying for the environmental damage due to their past emissions. Okay, so these are the issues regarding the climate change which came to the light again when the recent conference of the party of the UNFCCC was held. Okay, now, similar issue related to the climate change has again come to the light when some of the countries, some of the European countries are arguing, are pushing for including climate change in the United Nations Security Council's agenda or discussion. Okay, so the context is that the proposals by many countries that would have allowed the United Nations Security Council to deliberate on the climate related issues. Okay, and our issue, our understanding will be focused on what is the UNSC's role in such issues. Is UNSC able to deal with the climate change, or should it deal with the climate change? Why was the proposal opposed by some of the countries? Okay, recently there has been a draft resolution which is piloted by Ireland and Niger, and it had been in the making for several months and has sought to create a formal space in the Security Council for discussions on the climate change and its implications on the international security. Now, as far as the United Nations is concerned, there are already forums for addressing the climate change issues. Okay, for example, UNFCCC, we saw it recently in the last topic. For example, there is a United Nations Environmental Program, there is a United Nations Developmental Program, and many other bodies like a Food and Agricultural Organization, etc., etc. Okay, the United Nations has already a specialized agency which is a UNFCCC for discussing all the matters related to climate change. Okay, the parties to this UNFCCs, which are over 190 countries, have met several times every year. Okay, recently at Glasgow, and the meetings has resulted into the some of the important agreements and deals like a Paris Agreement, Kyoto Protocol, okay, and number of other measures which deals with the issue of the climate change. But as far as the United Nations Security Council is concerned, it exists primarily to prevent the military conflicts, okay, to maintain security and global peace. Now, what is the relation between this UNSC and climate change, how they interact with each other? Okay, for the last few years, the few European countries led by Germany have been pushing for the role of the Security Council in the climate change discussion as well. Okay, the draft resolution piloted by Ireland and Niger was not the first attempt at bringing the climate change on the Security Council's agenda. Last year, similar stronger resolution was proposed by Germany. Okay, so argument put forward by the countries are climate change induced food and water shortage, loss of habitat, livelihood, migration can increase the existing conflicts or even create new ones. So it is a climate change has a multiple issues, multiple impacts, which are global impacts. This can have implications for the United Nations field missions, okay, that are deployed across the world in peacekeeping efforts. So it is said that United Nations peacekeeping forces are there, which are there for maintaining peace. So now countries are saying that the climate change can impact their functions also. Climate change have a global impact. It should be brought under the United Nations Security Council, because climate change can disturb global peace and it can also lead to the conflicts. Okay, these are the arguments. However, it was never put to the vote. The Germany had initiated it because of the possible objections from the United States. Okay, now the Ireland and Niger agreed to refresh the draft resolution with the US. Now with the change in the US president's, okay, US position on the climate change is shifting under this new president Biden, and the draft resolution had drastic realistic chances of getting approved if the China and Russia, which are opposing this proposal from before, if they agreed or they abstained from the voting. Okay, so these two countries, Niger and Ireland, are hoping that it will get included in the United Nations Security Council. Now, although it is not the forum for discussing climate change issues, okay, still Security Council and its secretariat has hosted a few debates and informal discussions on the subject in the past. So climate issue is not totally totally out of this United Nations security jurisdictions or agenda. There are some of the instances, or there are some of the meetings where this agenda, climate change issue, has been in discussion and has been discussed. Okay, but it has not dominated the United Nations Security Council agenda. So it said several European countries, initially led by Sweden and Netherlands, began to make efforts towards integration of the security implications of the climate change in the Security Council's works. As I already told you, the European countries are pushing this for their security implications. Now, what are the oppositions to this move? Okay, Russia and China, two permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, they are having veto powers and they are opposing this move. Okay, now US is about, for US, because of this shift in the climate change issues, because of the shift in the United Nations presidents and its view on the climate change, it is countries are optimistic about the US position. Okay, but India has also opposed this move, which started a 2-year term in January and has joined the ranks with Russia and China. Brazil, which will join the Security Council next year, is also known to be against this move. See, these developing countries and many and these permanent members like Russia and China is also opposing this move. Okay. Now, what are their arguments? Why they are opposing? The opposition countries have been arguing that this UNFCCC must remain appropriate forum for addressing. The UNFCCC must remain appropriate forum for addressing this United Nations these climate change issues, and United Nations Security Council should concentrate on its main agenda of global security and peace. Okay, they are saying that in UNFCCC, the decisions are taken by consensus. So UNFCCC should be the appropriate forum. In UNSC, decisions are not made by the consensus. Okay, and the UNSC would enable climate change decision making by a handful of the developed countries like USA and France. Okay, which and other developed countries. They will determine this climate agenda, because they will have they are only the permanent members, and developing countries may not have any participation in the decision making. Okay, now what is the Indian argument particularly? So according to India, why is it that one needs a United Nations Security Council resolution to take action on the climate change when we have commitments under the UNFCCC? According to the India's permanent representative to the United Nations, Trimurti, he said the honest answer is that there is no real requirement for this. Okay, except for the purpose of bringing climate change under the ambit of the Security Council, and the reason for that is now decisions can be taken without the involvement of most developing countries. So naturally, in the UNSC, with the 5 permanent members, most of the developing countries may not be able to participate in the decision making and functioning of the United Nations Security Council. Is evident of this fact that developing countries are not involved in the participation in the decision making. So many of the UNSC members are the main contributors of the climate change. Developed countries, as I told you, they are the main contributors of the climate change, and these developed countries which are in the United Nations Security Council, if they start discussing the climate issue, if the climate issue becomes agenda of the UNSC, which is dominated by these developed countries, then they will naturally take the issues which favor them. They will take the decisions on the climate change which will favor them, and developing countries will be will not be able to participate in the decision making. Okay, now let's turn to the last issue of the today's discussion: changing monsoonal pattern of India due to the climate change. Recently, Indian Meteorological Department has also released one report which tries to tell us about the impact of the climate change on the Indian monsoons. Okay, it is true that climate change is altering the nature of the Indian monsoons, turning it into irregular, erratic, and destructive force. Okay, the country's first ever official climate change report, which is called as the Assessment of the Climate Change over the Indian Region, which is prepared by this Indian scientific community and published by the Ministry of the Earth Sciences in 2020, is lays out the state of the monsoon in rapidly heating world quite clearly. So according to this report, since 1951, monsoonal circulation has weakened. Okay, monsoon has become weakened, especially in the regions like Western Ghats and Indo-Gangetic Plains. But at the same time, the incidence of the heavy rainfall, cloud burst are increasing. So even though monsoon has weakened, still it has come in the form of heavy rainfall on mainly. Okay, now what has also increased is the duration of the dry spells between the rainy seasons, between the rainy days during the monsoon. So you can understand from this that though it is weakened, okay, though it is weakened, it has become more erratic. It has become it has become in the form of more localized heavy rainfall, and also the gap between the rainy dry spells has increased, or the duration of the dry spells has increased. Okay, one of the expert has said that the number of the rainy days is decreasing. Okay, so number of the rainy days is decreasing and length of the dry spell is increasing. There is not, but at the same time there is not much change in the total amount of rain. Why this is happening? Why the total amount of rain is not changing despite the number of the rainy days are decreasing? It is because whenever the rain is coming, it is mainly a heavy localized rain. It is mainly a cloud burst or mini cloud burst. Okay, so number of rainy days may be small, but when it rains, it will rain heavily, so that the seasonal total will be the same. Okay, so there are changes in the daily rainfall activity, and that is very obvious. So as the temperature rise over both land and ocean due to the climate change because of the global warming, the enhanced moisture content from the ocean will lead to the more instances of extreme rainfall. Okay, so due to the more heat, okay, the evaporation will take place and warm air will hold more moisture. Okay, this will happen even as the monsoon circulation weakens. Over the past 100 years, India has heated up by just 0.7 degrees Celsius against the global average as 1.2 degrees Celsius due to the atmospheric aerosols. If the atmospheric aerosols reduce, India will heat up at a faster rate. Okay, so when the heat increases, the warm water hold more moisture. Okay, and because of this more moisture, the extreme rainfall events increases. According to the recent IMD report released on the March 30, 2020, observed monsoon rainfall variability and changes across these 29 states and union territories. Okay, according to this report, between 1989 and 2018, 5 states, mainly UP, Bihar, West Bengal, Meghalaya, and Nagaland, have shown decreasing trend in the southwest rainfall, Okay, annual rainfall over these 5 states is also showing a decreasing trend along with Arunachal Pradesh and Himachal Pradesh. So monsoon is declining, it is becoming weak, but at the same time, it is saying that increasing trend in the frequency of heavy rainfall days over Saurashtra and Kutch, southeastern Rajasthan, North Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, adjoining areas of the southwest Odisha, and many other parts of the states. Okay, there is a paper called as a threefold rise in the widespread extreme rain events over the central India. According to this paper, which was published in Nature journal, the study states that despite weakening in the overall monsoon circulation, extreme rain events over the central India have increased threefold between 1950 and 2015. See, because for every 1 degree Celsius rise in the heat, atmosphere holds 7% more moisture. See, when air becomes warm, its moisture holding capacity increases. Okay. And this is also due to the rapid heating of the global ocean. Naturally, global ocean are heating more because it has absorbed 90% of the excess heat generated by the man-made climate change in the past 50 years. So naturally, atmosphere is holding 7% more moisture. Global ocean, over the global oceans, this becomes the moisture holding capacity of the air increases very rapidly. Okay, and because of that, extreme rainfall events becomes very frequent, as seen recently in case of Maharashtra. Okay, recently also the Pune's Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology came with a concept of a mini cloud burst. Okay, a mini cloud burst is defined as a rainfall in excess of 50 mm in 2 consecutive hours. So it is a torrential downpour, but lower intensity than cloud burst. Okay, based on hourly rainfall data from the 126 stations between these 1916 and 2015 period, the researchers have found an average 200 mini cloud burst occurring every year in India. So you can now understand how the rainfall is getting in the form of heavy rainfall, in the form of cloud burst, and in the form of mini cloud burst. So these are very common in the foothills of the Himalaya. Okay, while the west coast records more than 3 mini cloud bursts per season, Indo-Gangetic Plains and Saurashtra region receive 2 per season. Okay, as at just 1 per season, Rajasthan and states to the east of the Western Ghats experience the least number of the mini cloud bursts. So you can now understand how the climate change is impacting the monsoon. It is becoming weak, but at the same time, it is becoming in the form of cloud burst and mini cloud burst. The dry spells are increasing. Okay, the heat in the dry spell is increasing. Okay, and it is becoming irregular. The regional distribution is getting disturbed. More cyclone frequencies there. Cyclones are getting more intense. Cyclones are getting more frequent. So these are some of the issues that we discussed today relating to climate change. These were in the news in the recent months, okay, in the recent weeks and days. So thank you. We will meet again tomorrow. Goodbye. Take care.